Honorable delegates of the Intercollegiate Model African United Nations Summit, YALDA representatives, all observers, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocol observed, Mimawa Kwaba. It is my great honor today to introduce to you His Excellency John Agyekum Kufuor, former President of the Republic of Ghana. During his presidency, he served as chairperson of the African Union, during which he supervised a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Kenya, among others. He was also chairman of the Economic Community of West African States for 2 terms and saw the successful negotiations that brought peace to major post-war reconstruction to Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and Liberia. He introduced the health insurance scheme with free maternal care for pregnant women, under which about 56% of the population of Ghana was registered, and instituted the free school feeding program to provide 1 nutritious, locally produced meal a day for school children in kindergarten from age 4 to junior high school, age 14. Under Kufuor, the Agricultural Extension Services was reactivated and special attention paid to educating cocoa farmers on best practices. As a result, between 2002 and 2005, cocoa production in Ghana, the world's second largest producer, doubled from 350,000 tons a year to 734,000 tons a year, an all-time record in more than a century of cocoa farming in the country. As president, Ghana witnessed the fastest growth in its history, attaining a middle income status by 2006, much earlier than the projected year of 2015, envisaged under the UN Millennium Development Goals, and GDP reaching a record of 8.4% between 2007 and 2008, even in teeth of the international and economic crisis at that time. In retirement, President Kufuor has set up the John A. Kufuor Foundation on Leadership, Governance, and Development. He is currently a global ambassador against hunger for the UN World Food Programme, chairman of the UN Interpeace Programme, chairman of the Sanitation and Water for All Partnership, global envoy for the Neglected Tropical Disease Alliance, lead advocate for the Partnership for Child Development. He has served as leader of the Commonwealth Observer Mission on elections to Malawi and leader of the African Union Mission to observe elections in Sudan and Nigeria, leader of the International Republican Institute's pre-election monitoring team of the Nigerian elections. He led the Jimmy Carter Foundation Observer Mission to the first round of the Côte d'Ivoire elections. In 2011, he was named joint winner of the World Food Prize for Food and Agriculture with former Brazilian President Lula da Silva. Kufuor has received numerous awards, including the Chatham House Prize for Good Leadership by Queen Elizabeth II of Britain, Germany's highest national award, the Bundesverdienst by former President Horst Kohler. My apologies, I can't pronounce that. By President Horst Kohler, Liberia's highest award of the Grand Cordon in the most venerable order of the Knighthood of the Pioneers for helping to return peace to that country. He has received several doctoral honors degrees from universities in Britain, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to ask you to rise and welcome His Excellency John Agyekum Kufuor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is a singular pleasure to be in your midst today on this auspicious occasion, which is the inaugural session of the Intercollegiate Model African Union Summit, and to address you on this all-important topic, the need for visionary and effective leadership capacity in African youth. The topic is all the more important because of my estimation that the lack of good leadership in all aspects of our lives has been the bane of the African as we seek development on our continent. As the future leaders of our continent in all its spheres, you should aspire to finish your studies at this fine university and related universities, because you've come from many universities, both on the continent of Africa and beyond, not only with a degree, but also with the needed sharpened observation and critical faculties for social and economic development. You should have been imbued with the tenets of good leadership in your chosen fields of endeavor, so as to be able to help organize African societies that you will inherit. My friends, Africa is at the crossroads. What we need now is transformational leadership. A look back into history after the Second World War President Charles de Gaulle of France offered such a transformational leadership which stabilized the French ship of state and ushered in the Fifth Republic of that country that has endured since and made France the modern world power that it is today. Back home in Africa, albeit his non-stellar democratic credentials, the late President Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire was also a transformational leader. Under his astute political leadership, Côte d'Ivoire prospered economically due to a combination of sound planning and development of the country's significant cocoa, coffee, and horticulture agricultural sector, and good infrastructure, which underpinned an overall stable economy. This engendered the necessary self-confidence in the people of that country generally for development. Côte d'Ivoire became the financial and economic hub of Francophone West Africa and remained so through the decade-long political upheavals from which it is now recovering in record time. This is evidenced by the fact that the headquarters of the African Development Bank, which was moved to Tunis, has returned to Abidjan this year. Similarly, Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister and widely recognized as the founding father of modern Singapore, oversaw the separation of Singapore from Malaysia in 1965 and its subsequent transformation from a relatively underdeveloped colonial outpost with no natural resources into a first world Asian tiger, and he has since also become one of the most influential political figures in Asia and indeed the world. In the same vein, one can talk of transformational leaders since the past 50 years. One cannot talk of transformational leaders since the past 50 years without talking of Deng Xiaoping of China. Deng was a Chinese revolutionary, statesman, and the paramount leader of China from 1978 until his retirement in 1992. After Mao Zedong's death, Deng Xiaoping led his country through far-reaching market economic reforms after inheriting a country fraught with social and institutional woes resulting from the Cultural Revolution and other mass political movements of the Mao era. Becoming the core of the second generation of Chinese leadership, Deng is considered the architect of a new brand of socialist thinking, combining the Communist Party's socialist ideology with a pragmatic adoption of market economic practices. He opened China to foreign investment and the global market, and is generally credited with developing China into the second largest economy in the world today, and raising the standard of living of hundreds of millions of Chinese. Ladies and gentlemen, history would show that those leaders I've talked about, assumed their roles in their respective countries with clarity of vision, strong conviction, consummate knowledge of their respective nations, focus, and strong political will to transform them to improve the quality of life of their peoples. They were dexterous and astute in administering their nations to secure their places in the world. Yes, many of these people have been described as not democratic enough and at best as benign dictators. But none can be accused of not loving their peoples and for violating the basic human rights of their peoples. I have started my statement citing the examples of these outstanding leaders because of their historic achievement, in spite of the daunting challenges embedded in the governance of their respective nations at the times they assumed office. Looking at Africa at the closing times of colonialism, none of the territories, because that's what they were not nations, had the benefit of a political class having been nurtured enough in political, economic, and financial administration, and with the experience to take over from the departing colonialists. Indeed, in none of the territories had the indigenous people been allowed to participate as citizens in governance with equal rights as the administering authorities. Africans did not share in governance then. They were subjects and not citizens of the colonial rulers. Our education turned more into training to service the colonial government and the extractive and commercial industries, and hardly for governance. When the movement for decolonization ensued after the war, the colonial authorities were stampeded to set Africa free, and thus the first line of African leaders had no nurturing in administration, finance, monetary or economic management. So the pioneering leaders took office without much of the requisite governance experience. Not surprising, therefore, those leaders fumbled with governance, and indeed many became outright autocrats and dictators. One-party states became the order of the day on our continent. Their challenges were compounded, that's the leaders' challenges, were compounded by the fact that colonialism had carved the continent up arbitrarily, regardless of the ethnic groupings, cultures, etc., without due regard to the histories and sociological evolutions of the component peoples. Thus, the requisite unity for nation building was more imposed than innately existent. This situation rendered the first 3 decades of independence of much of Africa stagnated and saw wasted opportunities across the board, everywhere on our continent, wasted opportunities. It was not until the beginning of this century that Africa began to rise. Thus, real nation building in Africa is not much older than 2 decades. Until then, constitutional rule entailing harmonized institutional governance, such as among the executive, legislature, and judiciary, was haphazardous. The political classes did not cooperate with the professional civil and public services efficaciously to render good governance. Over-politicization had made the judiciary very nervous, and the media, touted as the fourth estate, became more the propaganda agency of the government authorities than as a check on political excesses and authority. In all, accountability and transparency were lost as attributes of governance, and the people were denied sovereignty. Into these contemporary times, what is needed in Africa is a focus on intergenerational acculturation of best practices of governance. Thankfully, this is being given effect to by the African Union, which has evolved out of the Organization of African Unity. You know that the Organization of African Unity was more for the liberation of the peoples of Africa. The liberation movement was the theme and didn't leave much room to governance. But the African Union now has come out of a charter that eschews non-democratic governance anywhere in Africa, and indeed prescribes upholding of the universal human rights of all the citizens of the component nations of the Union. Through agencies such as NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, and CADEP, thus Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, and the African Peer Review Mechanism, good governance practices are being instituted over the continent, and our economies are being reformed. The results of these are that over the past 2 decades, many African economies are growing at record rates. And within the past decade, of the 10 highest or fastest growing economies in the world, and in terms of GDP, 5 are in Africa. We have to be careful. Fast growth of GDP does not mean fast real growth on the ground, but still GDP is indicative that there's some growth. However, despite this, the growth that has been chalked has not seeped down to the citizenry generally, and the average man or woman of the continent cannot be said to be benefiting yet. Indeed, poverty pervades in many parts of our continent. The challenge, therefore, for you, the youth, and the future leaders of our continent, is to find solutions to our developmental challenges so as to have a positive impact on the fortunes of the ordinary African and bring the needed dignity to him or her. Leadership has always been critical, and into our current times of globalization, that is encompassing all and sundry around the world, resourceful, efficient, and effective leadership has become an even more universal requirement anywhere and everywhere in the affairs of mankind. Obviously, the easy availability of knowledge, as exemplified through the tremendous advances in science and technology, and their requirements in the making and implementation of policy, has made it an imperative that the would-be leader is adequately informed and abreast with the times. Into this 21st century, leadership will be defined more and more by knowledge and commitment to upholding humanity as the rationale for governance. And this implies inclusivity of all citizens, all the citizenry and stakeholders of the society. The ICT revolution has made information everywhere and anywhere instant. The world has been demystified and is now becoming smaller and smaller, and is but one market, the hallmark of which is competitiveness. The leaders of today and tomorrow must appreciate this and assiduously enlighten their societies or followers with education, industry skills, work ethics, and knowledge of the market standards in order to thrive. For the African continent, which geographically sits at the confluence of all the continents and had in the past become victim and exploitative grounds of the more advanced nations, this is doubly so and important for us, our continent. And to look at the geography of the world, Africa is squatting right in the middle, Europe to the north, Americas to the west, Asia to the east. They've all exploited us. Down history, it's not recent. It's down history. They've all exploited us. And so leadership must be aware of this to see how we organize our affairs to move from being exploited. Partnership as the African Union, NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa, this is what the African Union is telling us. We need to leapfrog, but we do so with leadership that is aware of history and then would form the partnerships that will enable us to. We are not going to reinvent the wheel, but we must be able to use, through science and technology, the partnerships that would quickly bring this, and then we move ahead. We are being courted, indeed, by all the powers of today because of the abundance of natural resources and the strategic market potential of our continent. The African youth, therefore, has to be well prepared with enhanced capacity for development and how to learn the transformational forces that are changing the world. It should be imperative for you to know the forces changing the world. You must know them at your fingertips. The forces are based on partnerships and interdependencies of nations and economies. Such partnerships, therefore, call for sharpened and principled negotiating skills. Whatever you are doing, learn to be able to negotiate. So it's win-win, as the Americans would say, for the partner and for you. Otherwise, you are taken for a ride. Ladies and gentlemen, as you leave this citadel of learning, when I talk of learning at Oxford, I'm talking of all the related universities as well. As you leave this citadel of learning, many of you will undoubtedly be called upon to offer leadership in several spheres. Your calling should lead you to acknowledge and believe that things can be made better in society and that you are prepared with knowledge, partnerships, consultations, wisdom, and character to lead to make such changes happen in Africa. You should acknowledge that leadership is a privilege and should be always reminded of the principle that power corrupts and that no leader is indispensable, no matter how good you may be. Don't think you are the only pebble on the beach. There are other pebbles. And that if you do not assume your role with responsibility, you should be prepared to be discarded. Sovereignty is with the people. In fact, sovereignty resides in the people. Therefore, you should recognize that whatever positions you hold, you should be accountable to them as regulated by the governing constitutions under which you work. The people indeed have the right to make and unmake their leaders. And you should earn and justify your continuance in office with them. Generally, however, It is an established fact that there is nothing more fundamental to good leadership than respect for the fundamental human rights of the people you lead, the rule of law, which nobody is higher than, and advancing the general welfare of the people or society you purport to lead. This facilitates justice, peace, equity, and belonging to prevail in any community. In our emerging societies, these attributes are especially prerequisites for social development in all respects. Your focus and commitment as leaders should seek to positively influence and increase the common good, as well as the social and moral development of your nations. Your bigger vision should be the betterment of common humanity, born out of mutual tolerance, regardless of religion, race, national origin, tribe, politics, or gender. Distinguished audience, an appreciation of the commonality of man will allow the leader to welcome the interdependency of nations and the upholding of human rights in all its various forms and everywhere. Above all, the self-confidence that you need to engender in your polities in all spheres in Africa should be homegrown. Leaders should be guided by the principle of contrariety of opinions. I'm standing here in Oxford. When you do a bit of philosophy here, you come to this. Contrariety of opinions, and not submit to the excesses of partisanship, especially on lines of ideology. Leadership should be wary of shortcuts, because there are no shortcuts to hard work, diligence, and dexterity in managing and applying the necessary principles so that they do not lose the vision of saving all the people and not just some of them, by ensuring that safety nets are provided for the vulnerable and less privileged. Some of you will be in politics, finance, business, academia, law, medicine, and other professions, and also in civil society organizations, NGOs, and so on and so forth. Wherever you may be, you should be guided by the Constitution and such other rules and regulations by which you assume your role or office. As African youth, you should seek to serve with a missionary zeal, understanding that Africa should take its rightful place among the Committee of Nations. As of now, we are in the margins. We want to move into center stage. And that's your mission, to serve Africa so Africa attains the rightful place among the nations. The world is hurtling along and has not the time to wait for slow learning and adaptation. My friends, the African Union has established the new Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, as the vehicle for African transformation so that the continent will leapfrog into the mainstream of globalization. So this is your challenge. It is how to create the capacity to attract the necessary investments and partnerships to add value to our abundant natural resources for us to secure a strong niche in the global market. It's very important. These are the expectations of leadership. In the new thinking of the post-2015 development paradigm, coinciding with finding urgent solutions for climate change, our leaders should attune themselves to the adoption of green modules of development. So green and sustainable modules of development. By the middle of this century, the African population, the population of our continent, is estimated to double to about 2 billion people. Will be about a fifth of the entire population of the world. Therefore, our leaders should attune themselves to finding sustainable growth and opportunities for employment and quality living for all our people, especially the youth. The Africa I know, I believe, will overcome the circumstances of today. We are not at the geographical center of the globe for nothing. We have so much of the raw materials that the world needs, especially materials that are adding value to the transformation of the world generally. But it's not just raw materials. Africa has also shown that we have the human resources for effective leadership. We have the Kofi Annans, the Aliko Dangotes, the Tijani Thiams of Prudential Insurance fame, who have attained their positions by learning the ropes of leadership and have excelled into the highest echelons of global standards in their respective occupations. They have done it, so I'm sure there are many more of them among us. You can do it. Similarly, the late Nelson Mandela exemplified moral and inclusive leadership devoid of bigotry. Looking back at the 50 years or so of post-independence era on our continent, Africa has had many rulers, but not that many leaders. Generally, rulers maintain the status quo and do not add much value to what they inherit, and sometimes even destroy what has been bequeathed to them. Leaders, on the other hand, with their insights and vision and focus and commitment, tend to be transformational. They add value and better the lot of the people they lead. The lack of visionary and effective leadership in Africa has not made it possible for us to have good governance and hence our underdevelopment. Here in Oxford and the related universities, you are privileged to be studying in institutions that have almost a millennium. Oxford is almost 1,000 years old, of history, replete with examples of successful leadership products behind it. The graduate from such a noble institution, by virtue of his or her exposure and adherence to the precepts of liberal arts education, based on empirical principles, should be ready to tackle leadership responsibilities effectively and with humility, and I stress humility here. It's important. And I have the confidence that when the time comes for you to be called upon for leadership anywhere, you will surely be up to the task. So this is the statement I have for you today. Thank you, and God bless all of you.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. I would like to open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, please raise it, and we will ask His Excellency to address it.
Thank you very much for the speech and then summarizing what we really need to do as transformational leaders. As mentioned, the leaders you're mentioning, including you and Lee Kuan Yew, contributed transformating strategies to their nations. And that is the reason why their nations became what they are today. I believe that, as you said, character is very important. So the two things that are very important for transformation leaders its character and strategy. My question is, which is more pressing, character or strategy? And if you have to be without one, which one should you be without? Thank you.
I will never be tempted to make such a choice. The leader should come rounded. The vision, the strategy should all be there. But it's the character that has the moral or human content to it. You may have an exceptionally bright, say, scientist, but for lack of character, that scientist might lend himself to the causes and the interests of authorities who would not be there to look at humanity or serve humanity. So you need the character as perhaps the bonding factor of the knowledge, everything should come together on the basis of character. So I won't choose between character and is it knowledge and visions, strategies. I won't. Leader should be rounded.
Thank you very much for the statement. I'm Natasha, I'm from Zambia. I have two questions. The first one is on the role of the African Union on the continent. I would like to hear your comments on whether you feel that the African Union has taken its position on the continent. Because I think the general feeling is that we don't see the African Union. And most of the time when we have a problem with the continent, we'll find that other organizations or other countries outside of the continent will respond faster than the African Union. For instance, I think we haven't heard a statement from the African Union on Ebola, and we haven't heard a strategy or anything that they are planning to do for the countries that are currently have that epidemic. So I'd like to really hear your view on what the position and the action of the African Union is. And then coming on the relationship with Africa and China, I think like you said, we've seen that China has grown over the past few decades. And there's a very strong relationship now between China and Africa. Do you think Africa is taking advantage of that relationship? And like you said, I think if you don't go to the table with your own needs, you'll definitely be taken for a ride. So do you think China is taking us for a ride? And then finally, I would like to ask about the opportunity. Do you think African leaders give opportunity to the youth to contribute? Because I think the young people, Africa is a very young nation, but what we see when we look at cabinet, when we look at most of the governments, there's a lot of, very few young people. Do you think we're being given that opportunity to contribute to the growth of our countries?
All right. African Union is just about, make it 13 years old, very young, and made up of 54 nations. I would say disparate. When you look at development, we are not on a level sort of plane yet. But African Union is doing a lot of good. I kept mentioning NEPAD many times, New Partnership for Africa's Development. I talked of the Constitutive Act, that's the Constitution of the African Union, eschewing non-democratic practices like coup d'etats and things like that. So you stage a coup, you are immediately sort of banished from the union. That's something, because till about 2 decades ago, we had more strongmen, dictators on the continent than now. Now, even if our practice of the ballot system is not quite adequate yet, at least most of us are moving in that direction. We are all using the ballot box to pick our leaders, recognizing sovereignty in the citizen. And I believe African Union has been a good agency there. And it's not just preaching, but CADEP, the Comprehensive Agricultural Program, is also helping. Now we are talking of climate smart agriculture, and CADEP is in the leadership there. They are talking of power pools. African Union is leading in that direction. Even with the health systems, Ebola has overwhelmed all of us. But the Africans are trying to play their role. To begin with, people didn't anticipate that epidemic or plague would rage as fast as it's going. So the countries in the front line, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, they were trying in their individual selves to do it. It's all within the past month or so. People have seen that the force of the plague is bigger than any one country. So everybody is rushing. Ghana now, for instance, has offered itself to be the base for extending help to the immediately affected areas. I believe Ghana is acting in the spirit of the African Union. So we shouldn't underrate or underplay the necessity of the African Union. The African Union is deepening our awareness of ourselves. It's helping us to appreciate that the continent is interconnected. So I believe African Union is shaping up and must be accorded the right place. It's leading. Then Africa and China. China, again, is a force. I talked of Deng Xiaoping. Till Deng Xiaoping, China was there, a mighty country, the most populous nation, and yet when you were talking in economic terms, it was in the doldrums. But within the past 2-3 decades, it's zoomed ahead, overtaking nations like Germany, Britain, everybody. It's now second only to the United States, which is also heavily indebted to China. China is moving, raging so fast. Everywhere you go, in all the continents, in every country, they are present. They are a force. That's why I also talked of negotiating skills. They are coming to us, not with some pistol drawn at our heads. They come with money. They offer credits that the other nations, powerful nations, are not able to offer. I remember our late president went to China for a state visit. Within 3 days, the man came back announcing China had offered $3 billion loan to Ghana. In all our history, we hadn't been offered even $1 billion loan. So this is what's happening. But China is not doing this because of charity. It knows what it wants. So it should be for us, our leaders, to know, now China is looming large and strong and it's offering to help us relay our infrastructure, do energy programs and so forth and so on. What does China want from us? When we think like this, strategize, we know what China wants, then we would be able to negotiate with China. So even as it gets what it wants from us, we also would get what we want from it. This is where the world is going now. And I believe our countries are, again, shaping up. Initially, some countries behaved as if China had come either because of ideology or charity. So the initial contact wasn't quite rosy. I believe when you look at Tanzania, Zambia rail line with China, it didn't go too well. Also, China's position in Zambia, I believe in the copper fields, hasn't gone too well. In Ghana now, when you talk of the Galamsey informal mining for gold, China is in all the villages bringing machines, but they take the gold, and a lot of times, I think they just go out with the gold without paying royalties and taxes to government. So we need to be very fast. As I say, the speed with which the world is opening up doesn't accommodate slow learning. We have to be sharp to be able to hold our interests vis-a-vis China or any other country. But there's no escaping the relationship, because the whole world is getting so interconnected. We are a common market, global market, and this is how leadership should see it and move quickly to play the role for Africa's interests. And youth opportunities. As much as I sympathize with the intent, I tell you, again with the fast-changing world, we have to redefine youth. In my day, a man may live, say, to the age of 40 and would consider himself youth. But now, at the age of 30, some youth are becoming CEOs of mighty international companies. At the age of 40, they are becoming prime ministers. Dave Cameron, I don't think he's yet 50. Obama became president of the most powerful nation on earth at the age, I think, of 50 or so, 48 or thereabouts. So we need to redefine youth. And what I'm trying to say is, you don't sit back to be invited. I'm not saying either that you should rush in to push the elderly aside. There's a lot to learn from them. Like I sit here now, I may be able to teach you a trick or two, in spite of my gray hairs. So it's intergenerational, as I say. It's like a relay. No, my generation has run its course, handing over the baton to perhaps even a generation before you. But if you do not change the batons well, it drops and you begin to lose the race. So yes, the youth of today is developing very fast. Perhaps you know more than any youth before your generation. But you should still acknowledge that the foundation had been laid before you. And if you are going to take over the foundation, you do it smoothly. The exchange of baton should be smooth. So don't sit back and wait to be invited. You move in ways. Learn the rope. So the earlier generation would feel a duty to give the baton to you as and when it should. But position yourself, work yourself up, and that's learning the rope. Apprentice yourself so in readiness to succeed. Don't sit back for power has a nature. The people who hold it, anytime it's time for them to give it up, they get sore and they may not easily want to hand over, not until they feel that they must give it, and that's preparing yourselves in readiness to take. That's my answer to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's see you.
That's pragmatic, eh?
Okay. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My question to you, and I'm glad you mentioned about Mr. Dong, because personally he's also my role model, because of how he revolutionized China's growth. And one of the reasons, because I was reading about him, that led to his transformative role is because he refused the Washington consensus. I don't know if you're quite familiar with it.
Have you educated me?
The Washington consensus is adopted by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to advocate for the global markets you're talking about. China, in its wisdom, especially Mr. Dong, cautiously adopted it, but Africa and Argentina readily adopted it, and that is why Africa, our markets are open to the world. Sorry, am I?
You'll finish your question.
Okay, in summary, my question to you is, according to your wise words and experience in governance, to what extent do you believe all of us here, as future leaders of tomorrow, should rely on international bodies for aid and streamlining our governance? Because the more they give to us, the stronger they get. And we rely on their aid. Yes, it is good,
look at ourselves, we fail to get our maximum potential of what we can do. So as transformative leaders of tomorrow, do you feel we are ready to start stepping back and gently leaving them to do what we feel is best for Africa? Because the moment we take control is the moment we shall be able to decide. So I would like your view, Your Excellency, as to what you think. Should we still listen to them and rely on them, or do you feel it is time for us to take a step, reflect and believe in ourselves? Because even if we make mistakes, there are mistakes and we shall learn from them, because they have made theirs and they have greatness to show for it. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you. I will start with the Washington consensus you talked about. China, ideologically, belonged with the Soviet Union against the West. The Cold War, China was included on that side. Washington was the champion of the West, the liberal economy, so forth and so on. So nobody would expect Don would readily buy the offer from Washington. But that man had a vision of what China could become, given the market potential, the fast learning capabilities and their capacities. But he saw that their ideology was hamstringing their capabilities, their capacity. So what he did was to cut the hamstring, to free the people. And so that's how the capitalist enclaves in China came about. For him to show the people, he wanted to carry his people with them of the benefits of the open market system. And truly, all within a decade or two, without succumbing to the temptations of the Washington offer, he proved that they could master the open market system, and even beat the West to it. So that's the story of Dong. It wasn't because he rejected the Washington offer that he succeeded. He knew what to do to outcompete the other players in the market. I believe that was the real, that's my interpretation, the way I see it. And this is why, to me, he's the leader I'm citing to you. Think and strategize. Then aid relevance. The choice really is not between aid and trade and the argument that has been raging. When you are coming from a handicap, and unless you want to invent your own wheel, which really would require so much effort, resource, research, and so forth and so on, you use some opportunities. Aid, if it's not coming as arms, like you give arms to, say, the beggar. If aid is not coming like that, but it's coming to empower you, to enable you stand on your feet and do things for yourself. It's not something you spend. You don't say no out of pride. Use what comes to you to build your capacity and capabilities. So then you stand on your own feet to do things for yourselves. Africa has been so exploited over the centuries, using human resource to build other places, other natural resources exploited with no benefit to us. So now, economically, we do not compete. We are in the margins when we are talking of development. And so naturally, it's a phase. We are in a phase where we should grab opportunities, even if it's aid, to build competitive capabilities. But it should also be part of a strategy. Leadership should know when to use some aid to strengthen its economic competitiveness, to stand on its feet.
So you're saying that we're not yet ready, we should wait?
Well, it's a phase, it's a movement, transition. You don't cut it sharp. But everything is left to the management discretions of leadership. It's not everything you go for. Aid with strengths that would continue to keep you down under is dangerous aid. It's like luring some chicken with maize, so you grab it. That's not good. So you use aid that would strengthen you rather than weaken you. And talk of capacity development. Yes, we should do it for ourselves. We are talking of, even though it's an interdependent world we are going into, there's a strong measure of self-reliance, and that's human resource development. Leaders should build through education, through exposure to best practices, through the opening up of the vision of their people. People should understand the forces shaping the world, generally within, so that leadership would not be alone up front with the leaders, led left behind, far behind. That way, you don't get rounded development. And I believe you are in the process of building your capacities to shape the economies of your respective countries. Okay. Thank you.
Shall we take 3 other questions and limit them to just 1 sentence? Thank you very much. One more and one.
Thank you very much, Excellency. My question is, to welcome to any exciting person on the issue of political insurgents and instability on the continent. And from what we've been able to understand, we play the pivotal role in settling some dispute. So I was just going to ask that, what is really different this time? Why is it that we are having issues of insurgents all over the continent, and the African Union is finding it very difficult to solve some of this problem? And as emerging leaders, what exactly should we do? What's the way to go? What are we not getting right now? And what should we do when we get there to ensure that, because without this political stability, development becomes difficult in some of these countries, and we will not be happy that Africans keep dying, killing ourselves, and giving us arms to harm ourselves. Just want to ask that from your own world of experience, what should we do about the insurgents on the continent? Thank you.
Shall we take...
All right.
Comrades from Oxford University. From South Africa. Just a question on the statement in the speech where you said that we have rulers and not leaders. I wanted to ask that, are we noticing that leaders are in Africa? Yeah, I'm asking, I've been noticing, and I'm asking a question to you, sir, that it looks like our leaders are leading from the back and not from the front. How do we address that? Because it looks like we are ruling over, but not ruling to go forward, or not leading to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my question is about character. And I believe that we need, as you said, we need character. But then, as society creates the leaders, and over time we realize that the leaders don't have enough character to be leaders. So what can we do as a society in order to ensure that these leaders have the character? That's why I thought education could solve the problem, but then education has not well solved it. So what should be in line with the educational system so that people build the character they need for leadership? Thank you.
All right. Insurgency. Insurgency is also changing. Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone suffered insurgency in a way within their local milieu or context. If you are talking of Boko Haram, it's an insurgency that has such an international is it involvements? As yet, who knows Boko Haram, really? Is it there on the spot in Nigeria, some place you can say that's Boko Haram, so you go to attack it? What I'm trying to say is that there are international forces, and this is part of the things you should prepare yourselves with. Appreciate the forces shaping the world evolution. Look at the Middle East now. A new group emerges, styling itself like a new nation, and it's spreading like a cancer among nations there. So people really can't identify the source, and they are having to run into exile from their homes. That's the insurgency that we are meeting now. The forces at work around the globe now some are so powerful, and again, this would call for partnerships among nations to be able to contain and perhaps eradicate these forces. I believe last week at the United Nations, or is it this week? Last week, Obama had tried to address this thing, calling for partnerships and to tackle it. So partnerships of earlier times, or insurgencies of earlier times, I believe are not as easily tackled as those we are seeing now. Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIS, these are, I can say they are not national in terms of limited to a nation. And the best approach might be the cooperative effort among nations, because in a way it's like a bit like the Ebola we are talking about. And like a wit in Ghana said once about malaria, he said, the mosquito doesn't need a visa to cross the border from Ghana to Togo. So we should all be collective in trying to move this thing, eradicate it from. It touches one area before you know it's spreading all over other areas. So it's not easy, but it needs a global effort to tackle these challenges. And then rulers and leaders, and that leading from behind. Sometimes leading from behind may be strategic, might be tactical and strategic. Generals, military generals, are not supposed to go to the war front, because you shoot them, since they are the source of strategy, you shoot the general, the side may collapse. So it becomes part of strategy that the general may remain at home. They say they die in their beds. They don't die on the war front. So they stay at home, but do the vision which they get their people to share in. So they deploy their forces to attack their opponents. If that's the sort of leadership we are talking about in Africa, then I say there may not be too much bad about it. But the distinction between rulers and leaders, like say you are born a prince, whether with all due respect you are wise or not. Once born a prince, you become automatically entitled to. So you sit on your throne and you are a ruler. Your word may be law. People like them may not add much value. I'm not saying all rulers are not transformative. You may get some good kings under whom their people prosper. But the leader, in the context we're talking, is the one that, as I said, the people make. If, say, in a democratic context, you win the confidence of your people because you share the vision with them to convince them that you are the person that can take them forward to wherever they want to go, then they have made you. And such a leader, I believe, tends to do the things, lead the people into transformational modes, because that's the justification for the continued leadership he enjoys. And if, say, such a leader might work the people from behind, I say, why not? Let it happen. It's the results we want. Then character. Yes, you talked of the people making, they're saying in politics that people get the leadership they deserve or government they deserve. So if the people exercising their right of choice would allow themselves to be coaxed through corruption in politics. Some people the aspirants will go dishing out monies and promises and that sort of thing. And if the people would buy into such things to give leadership to a person who proves undeserving, then they have themselves to blame. But if they chose believing that this person aspiring to lead is virtuous and will lead them to good ends, and yet such a person failed them, and again in a democracy, the right of choice through the ballot is in the people. Of course, you work by the Constitution. So, say you trick the people to get leadership this time. 4 years hence, the same people will go back to polls, and if they know what they want, they'll remove you and bring other people who might do better. But I agree with you that people getting to know, getting to make the right choices, tend to be prepared through education. Education that would enable them know, say, the quality of education they want for their children, job creation for the youth, rule of law to give orderly societies to them. They take all these things into account. And then, if I may be permitted to also use the other qualification, God-fearing people. This guy may be smart, may talk all the fine things, but is he the type you'd entrust your money with? Is he the type that would show fellow feeling to you? So you take all these things, and education tends to give capacity to the people who would make the choice. So character through education is good. Mm.